Welcome back to the Cage Rage podcast. This is Devin, and UFC 243 is in the books. And there's an old saying that it's one thing to talk the talk, but it's another thing to walk the walk. And every now and then you have a face that comes out in the area of sports who commands attention, gravitates a lot of energy around him, a lot of hype, and then he goes out and he backs it up. And I think that Israel Adesanya is starting to put himself in that category of a shorthand of special athletes that we see every generation that come in and they rise to the occasion in big moments and prove that they are the real deal and back up their words with spectacular performances. And tonight was the first step toward the legacy that Izzy Adesanya is now building. Last style bender goes in and finishes Rob Whittaker in the second round to become the undisputed middleweight champion of the world tonight in the main event at UFC 243 in front of 60,000 people at Marvel Stadium in Melbourne, Australia. Miguel, what is your initial thoughts on tonight? That was this is Israel Adesanya's night, would you say?
Oh, in many ways he proved me wrong. I thought Whittaker would have some advantages that he could work on here, but none of them showed up, in the stand-up, Gastelum had broken through and maybe at times had landed on Adesanya. And, I saw a lot of, Whittaker saw that, knew that, but, Adesanya made adjustments because I saw a lot of Whittaker whiffing. I mean, a lot of whiffing. He was and throwing big, one fight to end, one punch to end it all kind of thing. What happened to, putting body shots together? What happened to the kind of things that we'd credit him with in the past? He wasn't able to get off, and it's because the bottom line is against a guy like Adesanya, trying to box is from outside and work your way in. Is the worst possible strategy. You know what I mean? You got to come up with a couple other wrinkles, I think. You kind of played into his game. And, not to criticize Adesanya. Adesanya unscratched after the fight and very confident and stuff like that. And unlike, in the past with some other guys and stuff, I think he's at the point where he deserves that acknowledgement. A lot of guys, he got that prodigy kind of label kind of early, and we've seen guys peter out and not make good on that before. So he's right on the doorstep of doing the opposite. He's right on the doorstep of breaking through. So more power to him. He proved me wrong, and he showed Whittaker to look slow and average, and not on the same level, and that was not what I expected.
Yeah, as I mentioned in my little short monologue that I had, it's one thing to talk the talk, but then to back it up and walk the walk. And as you mentioned, you see as soon as somebody comes out and they have a lot of hype behind them, the very first thing that people are starting to ask is, who's going to derail the hype? You start getting this, you're either on the hype train or you're starting to signal toward who's going to knock that train off course and is going to expose them. And I still think there's a lot of questions to be answered with Adesanya. I think that we still haven't really seen him fight somebody that's going to come in, really push the wrestling. And I think that could come in the future. There's still things to be seen. He's only been fighting in the UFC for about a year and a half now. He's now 7-0 inside the octagon. Just getting a little bit into just just analyzing this fight, though. One thing that I was saying leading up to this is I really felt like Kelvin Gastelum was kind of overlooked and disrespected leading up to this fight, because I don't know how, if I had a nickel for every time I heard, well, if Kelvin can hit him, Whittaker's definitely going to hit him. And you had this.
I made that mistake. Yeah.
You said it, but you weren't the only one. I mean, I literally, that was the perspective of a lot of people. And
Whittaker said it himself too in an interview. Yep. That's where I pinched it from. So, but continue. Go ahead.
Well, yeah, you're right. Even Whittaker said that the same thing. And the thing that I was asking, I was like, well, that might be true, but number one, that's really undervaluing how good of a boxer Kelvin Gastelum is. But also, is Rob Whittaker going to be able to take what Kelvin Gastelum took? Kelvin Gastelum took a lot of damage for 5 rounds against Robert Whittaker, and it was very, very impressive. That was the big takeaway that we were talking about in this exact moment after Adesanya and Gastelum was, Adesanya was phenomenal. Gastelum, wow, he's the toughest man that we've ever seen, because he got dropped 4 times in one fight and took so much damage in that fight and still hung on, still trudged forward, was able to hurt him in the 4th round. We didn't see that from Rob Whittaker. Now, we saw cleaner strikes land tonight, I think, with a lot of power behind them. I mean, that at the end of the first, the 2nd round knockout was great. The end of the 1st round might have been even cleaner, and he was saved by the bell with that, because that fight would have been over if it wasn't for the bell. He was badly hurt and then comes out. And when I look at Adesanya once again fought he's clearly got an insanely high fight IQ, and that probably comes from having an insane amount of combat experience from 80 kickboxing fights and a lot of, I'm sure, a lot of amateur bouts, a lot of gym strategy, he's had boxing fights. He's had a lot of MMA fights now. And he fought this fight poised, confident. We do got to definitely talk about the theatrics that he brought tonight, because he's now a megastar. I mean, this was 60,000 people at Marvel Stadium, as we mentioned. He comes out, he comes out looking like Michael Jackson on his walkout, dancing with people and seeming just the one thing that nobody, no matter what they felt about Conor McGregor as a human being, that gravitated toward people too, whether they loved him or hate him, was that he had this unshakable confidence that was clearly real. It wasn't faked. And we saw Aldo in his big moment against Conor McGregor walk out, and he looked a little flustered. He didn't look confident. He looked a little like the moment was getting into him. And there's even audio of, in the moment, while they're in the cage, Joe Rogan talking, saying, look at Aldo. He looks nervous. I think that Rob Whittaker seemed a little more urgent tonight. I thought he seemed very nervous in the cage. I thought he seemed like he was really trying to force something on Whittaker, on Adesanya, and Adesanya looked like he was just really measuring his timing, getting his range, and he just looked so much crisper and so much better timing, so much more power, faster, and more experienced. And he's a champ now. And what I do want to throw it back to you though on is this theatrics. What kind of a star does the UFC have now in Adesanya? What's the potential for his stardom internationally? I mean, they know they got a home down there in Oceania, obviously, now that they can go back and redo this with him there anytime now. We know he's a big star in the States. We talked on our pre-fight about potential Africa fights in Nigeria. They could have a serious global superstar now with Israel Adesanya. Would you agree?
I think a lot of things have to fall into place correctly, including, what you're working with there. I think they put out a lot of feelers for a guy, and every once in a while it blows up into a Rousey or a McGregor or whatever it is. It could happen here. I couldn't help but notice that it did look like, on the way in, it did look like Whittaker got more of a pop. There is that situation there where, I think people sort of take it. He may also not have 100% of a home yet. You know what I mean? Maybe when he goes back to Nigeria, or he becomes a Vegas star, and it doesn't matter. But talent-wise, he's on the cusp. I think there are a lot of the questions that I want. What would you do as a matchmaker? I would put him in with Yoel Romero next, because that's the big question: is what does he do with a real wrestler? And if he does what he does with everybody else, and that is. Romero could be out IQ'd, I think. But, if he can fool Romero into a distance boxing match where Romero's winging punches and trying to knock him out like he did Rockhold and stuff like that, and doesn't even get into wrestling, then, more power to him. But I do want to see how he does with a Jacare, with a Romero. Those would be the two superior ground fighters, I think, in that weight class right now,
Well, I would say that, they are already signaling toward Costa, that Paulo Costa is going to get the next fight.
Yeah, of course.
And he's not really known for his wrestling, but what he is known for is an insane pressure. And he even did it against Yoel Romero. He was even willing to go straight forward, push the pace against Romero. And I think that that'll be a little different on Izzy, but I agree with you that I think the real style fight would be Romero because of the wrestling, because he's got he's got a X factor in there that could really play into it. I think Costa, I think you'll agree with me. I think that his style of pressing forward with striking, that's going to be horrible. As you just mentioned about running forward, trying to take your head off, like Whittaker kind of did tonight. I think that's going to be terrible against Adesanya.
We've got bad examples, like how to go for Jose Aldo. They could have pranced around the ring for a minute and a half, and then Aldo could have charged, and the same exact thing would have happened. You know what I mean? There are other examples of people that get, they get taken out of their fight and stuff like that. See, that's the thing, is to be Costa is going to come with the same type of thing that Adesanya is familiar with and seen, and he's going to be fine with that. And there isn't going to be a striker that you find that's going to worry this guy. Short of rejuvenating Roy Jones to when Roy Jones was 23 years old or whatever. You know what I mean? That you're not going to find a striker who's going to worry this guy, and he wants to fight at heavyweight. He's going to be fine because he's such an athlete and stuff. But he's not all that huge. So, I'd caution some of that talk. But at 205, I think we've already mentioned some of the names, Jacare, Romero. Those guys are the old school. And I'm all right with if the UFC wants to go ahead and start sunsetting them and not keep giving them chances. But I do think that they still present some interesting challenges. Likewise, I think that Adesanya adds his name to that list as guys from the middleweight division who will be dangerous at 205, even to a John Jones. Romero Jones, maybe Romero's getting past his prime now, but Romero Jones could be a hell of a fight still.
Yeah, I think that we're really looking at the UFC trying to really groom at this point after tonight is going to be the super fight between Jones and Adesanya. It's just going to be all about timing at this point. And I think they're going to – I said this beforehand that we're probably dealing now, and especially the way this unfolded tonight in the spectacular dominant performance and in the fashion that everything unraveled with. Unfortunately, the only bad thing I can see is this could turn out to be another division that we have. It's not going to become so black and white who the champion's going to fight next. It appears that, because out of his own mouth, he wants to fight Costa next, which that'll be two up-and-comers, undefeated. And I think he looks at that as going to be a favorable matchup for him, that he can go in and get another win. And it'll probably be a pretty exciting fight. But ultimately, in the long game, he's even mentioned himself. He's saying Raiders Stadium in 2021, and you got John Jones coming out saying, "Let's do this in Africa. Let's do a rumble in the jungle in Africa." And the UFC is going to be mulling their options about what they can do with these two. And as I've mentioned with John Jones, he doesn't really have anybody right away. I mean, he could run it back with Anthony Smith. He could fight Jan Blachowicz. He could fight the winner of Weidman and Dominic Reyes. He could fight the winner of Johnny Walker and Corey Anderson. I don't think that they're going to rush him in with a Johnny Walker or an Alexander Rakic or a Dominic Reyes or some of these guys, some of these younger, tough contenders, before they would start pursuing this money fight with Adesanya. Because and one thing that I do want to ask you a little bit, because that is going to become, I think, a narrative, an even more common narrative moving forward is going to be Jones and Adesanya. Did Adesanya after tonight become the A-side?
Man, the thing to me is I'm not sure that we're not rushing a fight here. Some of those fights, he hadn't even won the belt yet, and they're calling out super fights of the guy that a lot of people think is the GOAT, GOAT with an asterisk, but whatever. But, it's hard to argue it with Jones has done in the ring. The fact that Jones is mulling it over and talking about it, the fact that Dana and the presentation you've gotten it, it's obvious that they want it. But is it a great idea? I don't know. To me, first question I want to answer is I want to see Adesanya and Jones side by side. I want to see what the difference is, just an eyeball test. Because to me, Adesanya he's a big middleweight, but is he a bigger middleweight than Luke Rockhold was? Is he a bigger middleweight than some of the like the Weidmans and some of the real big guys that we've seen before? Maybe he is. But, maybe that style bender, the fact that he's faster than those guys, maybe, makes you think he's maybe a little skinnier. He said it himself in the post-fight interview. So that's the one question I have. What does he match up with? Because Jones, if Jones wasn't cutting weight, Jones would probably be fighting about 230. That should be a notable size difference, and that would turn me off to the fight, to be honest.
Yeah, I think Adesanya is actually a little bit. I mean, he's as you mentioned, he is a big middleweight. I think that he is somebody kind of like in that Max Holloway territory for 145 and 155. I think that if he were to fight his next fight in 3 or 4 months at 205 pounds, he would look very small, especially against a Johnny Walker, who's a huge man, or a John Jones, who's a huge man, or some of these guys.
Remember when Anderson Silva jumped up and he just liquefied?
He looked amazing at 205. So that's a good point.
You have to say that Adesanya has similar potential. You don't want to rule it out, right? But I do think in that fight, Silva was a little bit physically smaller than Forrest. You know, size isn't everything. He proved that. Adesanya seems to have that same package of skills. But let's do some of this stuff because he keeps fighting strikers. His next fight's a striker. I want to see some of the other stuff that makes it mixed martial arts. And, you know, if he falters, you know, so did Uriah Hall. Uriah Hall came with a lot of hype.
Yeah, I agree with that. But I think that if Adesanya got some adequate time, I think these guys sometimes rush their move up in weight. I don't think that he's struggling with his weight cut at all. He hasn't had any kind of issue in the past. I think that if he did it properly and put on some weight, he can make this move up and be pretty stout at 205. But I'm not saying that that's going to be, I don't know if he's going to make a permanent, that's a 20-pound gap. That's even bigger than the 15-pound gap that I've been, decrying for a long time between 155 and 170 and 170 and 185. The 20-pound gap is even bigger than that. And the talent pool is a lot smaller. So, I mean, I think he would easily be a top 10 light heavyweight just due to the talent. But when you get up to that upper echelon, I mean, you're talking about guys who can easily fight at heavyweight. And you're talking about heavyweights that are just a little bit lazy, who are walking around at 230 or so, who could even push down there. We've seen that recently with Jared Cannonier, who was another guy who started at heavyweight, got himself together physically, and now he's down at 185 pounds. But
yeah, I don't think Adesanya goes to 205 anytime soon. I think he stays right where he was. If you wanted to move him up and you wanted to find out fast, I'd put him in with Glover Teixeira. Teixeira, he's been on an upswing and fighting smart. So how does he look at a guy who's a killer striker that similar to the reputation he has, and how does a real pro break him down? If Adesanya wipes that guy out with the size difference, experience, and all that sort of stuff, then 205 isn't going to be an issue, and he should stay there. He shouldn't go back to 185. I don't think it's an Anderson Silva job where you're going back and forth and stuff like that. I don't think that's necessary with this kid. I think he could stay put, do Costa. I think the smart thing to do, I want to see it, but the smart thing to do is sunset Jacare and Romero. They're out of the title picture. Bring it up to Costas and all the young guys. Have Adesanya beat 2 or 3 of them and have him move up organically. That's probably the best way.
Yeah, and I think that you're probably right. We've got kind of on a rabbit trail talking about the potential of Adesanya at 205 pounds. But in reality, when you look at this middleweight division, it's pretty exciting right now. You've got Rob Whittaker, which we can briefly touch on. I think we both can probably agree it's going to be, man, he's got a long road ahead of him to ever try to get a rematch with Adesanya. If Adesanya is going to be the superstar that I believe that he's going to be, especially after this, because we saw that with Conor McGregor. I mean, when you get these guys in there and you finally get to fight with them, and they're these big superstars, and they win so handily, you can't really top those performances. It's going to be really, I mean, Conor McGregor on top of the game. The only way that Jose Aldo is going to ever get a rematch with him would be like something right now where Conor needs to win, and I still think it would be a bad decision because how can you ever top 13-second knockout?
Yeah, Whittaker's in trouble.
Yeah, as a champion, it's as long as Adesanya's at the helm here, it's going to be so hard for Whittaker to ever get back there. Just the UFC even running back, he didn't move the pay-per-view needle at all as champion. He was kind of forgotten. He was inactive for a long time. He's got a long road ahead of him, and I think he knows it. But when you look at this middleweight division, you still got Yoel Romero, who you said is probably the biggest interesting style matchup for Izzy Adesanya. It's Adesanya for sure. But then you got this Cannonier guy who's coming out killing guys. You still got Costa, who's an undefeated top prospect, who just got a decision win, no matter how controversial, in a very exciting fight over Yoel Romero. And then you still have somebody who really, as I mentioned, I think is a big winner tonight, indirectly. That's Kelvin Gastelum. Showed that he could hang with this guy for 5 rounds, put on an amazing fight. I think there's going to be a lot more fan interest from not only the casual fan, the hardcore fan, but also the UFC, and potentially running that back than it ever will be with Whittaker. Kelvin Gastelum gets through Darren Till impressively. He's going to be still there. He's going to get somebody that's going to possibly get him a fight back with Adesanya. Whether Adesanya wants to do that when he's got other options, he's got super fight potential with John Jones, I don't know. But nevertheless, I think that he's in a better position after tonight than even Robert Whittaker is, as long as Adesanya is the champion.
The bottom line is you're talking about 2 fighters on different trajectories. And you're right, Adesanya's copying the upward trajectory of a Conor McGregor type. That's what it looks like. He's got the UFC's backing for it. Robert Whittaker, I'm worried that we're looking at a Johnny Hendricks type of, activity here where he just starts to fall off. He starts to maybe, try to redeem himself in some tough fights, whereas maybe, a remodeling would be the right thing to do. If some of those don't go his way, he could see the bottom drop out real fast. And I'd hate to see that. I think he's a real hardworking kid. Obviously he's a man, not a kid anymore, but he's still a young man and stuff. But yeah, he was just today is going back to the drawing board day for Rob Whittaker. There's just he had no answers. Even if the knockout power hadn't come, and you're right, it manifested itself every round, right, for the 2 that it lasted. But even if it didn't come, you could Adesanya's nose wasn't bloody. He wasn't touched. And Whittaker's face is already starting to show attrition. So not only the big shots landed, all the little stuff was getting done. He wasn't winning that fight.
No. And no matter what comes to Rob Whittaker, I do want to say that I think that he's an awesome man, an awesome fighter, and I will thank him forever for his great fights with Yoel Romero, because they were great. But man, if this is probably Israel Adesanya at this point, barring some kind of amazing performance, amazing spectacular knockout from one Jorge Masvidal next month, is probably looking at him probably cemented himself tonight as the fighter of the year when you consider the Silva fight, the Gastelum fight, now winning the title, with his attention, with his rise. And if this has been a spectacular, wonderful 2019 for Israel Adesanya, it has been a terrible one for Rob Whittaker. Loses his title fight with Kelvin Gastelum, hernia surgery, more inactivity, and then gets knocked out on his comeback fight. So terrible fight, but nevertheless, this was the Style Benders night. We're going to move on now to the co-main event. There wasn't too much name value on this card. This was actually a pretty, like I mentioned in the pre-fight, this was kind of a one-horse show. When you really look at this card from top to bottom, this was all about the main event. But the co-main event had some attention, and I mentioned it also in the pre-fight that this was a big opportunity for Dan Hooker. Came in ranked number 15 in a very stacked lightweight division, taking on the number 6 ranked Iaquinta. Big opportunity to make a big jump in the rankings and really cement himself as a top 10 lightweight. And he did just that in his home country in Australia. Looked, I thought, better than he ever did, and against the best opponent he's ever beat. And Dan Hooker really dismantled Iaquinta. You want to talk about somebody that's, I'm not sure it's going to be a back to the drawing board moment. I think it might just be go and sell houses at this point. Iaquinta was a guy who really had a lot of tussles with the UFC back in the day, and he's got avenues to make good wealth outside of the cage. He fights because he loves it. We all know that. And he was at his career high when he got the Khabib fight, then got another win over Kevin Lee. But he's really been knocked back down this year. That's been a terrible 2019 for him too, losing to Donald Cerrone and now losing to Dan Hooker. So I think that we could possibly have just seen the last of Iaquinta, as much as a good fighter as he is. Man, this is a Manhattan. This is a boy who can go sell penthouses on Long Island. He does not need to be going into traveling across the world and fighting the best fighters in the world in his weight class. But for Dan Hooker, I can't get the image of him getting battered so bad by Edson Barbosa, though, out of my mind. But nevertheless, he fought very well tonight. He just knocked out James Vick. I think he's a top 10 lightweight. I still have some concerns about him. I was saying it tonight that he doesn't move his feet. He's got very slow feet, but he is a great striker. But I still got some concerns with Dan Hooker, but I think that he is very legit, and I think that there's a great deal of talent at this weight class that he'll do exactly what he just did tonight against.
Well, he's long and tall, and that helps in the striking game. Like you said, I think he's sometimes gets stuck in molasses and stuff, but it was enough with Iaquinta, the length and stuff like that. Iaquinta, he hasn't changed his game much, and the bottom line is you spend a couple of years selling houses and stuff like that, and you get a reputation. He's doing all right. He doesn't need the money. He comes back, this, that, the other thing. At the end of the day, you blew a couple of years of your prime, and now you're coming back against a guy like Dan Hooker down near where he lives, and you're 32, 33 years old. Man, I don't know. The house selling stuff has always been a good fallback stuff, but using it as a negotiating tactic, and you're being okay. He, like I said, there were, there was a time period there where inactivity, he didn't fight at all in 2016, for example, stuff like that. I mean, to once in 2015, right around that period, that would have been the time that would have been his prime. And everything after that is becoming a crafty fighter. And at the end of the day, using your skill and stuff. Now, he's highly skilled, but how do you bake that into a game plan and stuff like that? He didn't have enough fights. He didn't have enough fights for the strategy against, Cerrone, and, even against a guy like Hooker, who's got 8 losses. You say he's got 8 losses. Hey, if you win from every, if you learn from every loss, now you're talking about a guy who's won 6 of his last 7. That's a whole different ballgame.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that there is a way, though, for Iaquinta to still remain very relevant in the sport, and I want to hear your thoughts about it. He has been, as I mentioned, a very vocal critic of the UFC's treatment of its fighters, and he's been a very vocal representative for a potential unionization for the fighters. And we know that Ray Longo is incredibly popular, one of his trainers. Matt Serra's got his own podcast and doing great things. Both these guys, all three of these New Yorkers have that New York fighting spirit and that personality that people really like to gravitate toward. I would like to see Iaquinta step back from fighting and use his voice as kind of an ambassador to try to improve promotion fighter relations and possibly lead the fight while not having to worry about training for a fight and preparing for a fight and staying in the gym and keeping in good with the UFC because they control his purse. I would like to see him kind of step back from that and lead the fight toward potentially organizing fighters and creating promotional ways to promote unionization that could benefit the fighters. And I think that's something that he would be passionate about moving forward. What's your thoughts on that? I think that that'd be a good way for Iaquinta to still use his brashness, but in a very effective way that could really have his name memorialized for years to come.
I think it's a touchy subject. I think, there's been many different athletes and many different efforts and levels of efforts, and at the end of the day, it's going to take a monumental effort to really break down what the UFC does. What happened to Kung Lee?
Mm-hmm.
Kung Lee really looked like he was in a good position. How about Mark Hunt when they put him in with Lesnar, who had tested positive and stuff like that? They just threw some money at him, and at the end of the day, he stopped complaining and stuff like that. So, I mean, Iaquinta, obviously, with charisma and stuff like that, maybe the New York pushiness and go-getter kind of mentality would help in a leadership role there. Something's got to be done. I'm afraid it's bigger than Iaquinta. Could he play a role? Yeah, I think he could definitely play a role, and even a spokesman's role. I'm impressed with him. I'm not trying to put him down, but I do think it's the right time for him to retire. And then, I would look at his career path, and I would try to avoid following the same bugaboos if I were a fighter. Although if you have other income and stuff, I'm not encouraging you to not pursue that, obviously. So he's a very interesting case study, and that experience on that end may make him a good leader for it. But I do, like I said, I think it sums it up. I think at think that the issue there is bigger than just Al.
Yeah, I agree. I just think I would just like to see him use whatever platform that he has. As I said, kind of capitalize off the popularity of that whole team with Longo and Sarah, and use whatever platform they have to really be able to free him up by stepping away from fighting, by stepping away from having to worry about working with the UFC to negotiate deals, to just kind of step back and be able to come from an outsider to like kind of lead a charge, to do stuff that he's tried to see done in the past, but kind of been a little bit hindered by the fact that he's got to work with these people on negotiations to get a fight and stuff in the future. So that was just a thought, but just wrapping this up, just looking down the line of this card, you got Sergey Spivak defeating Tai Tuivasa. That was sad in Australia. So Tai Tuivasa was a prospect coming up. He really isn't developing very well. I don't know how much he's got left on his contract. I think I've always enjoyed his interviews. He's had some good performances, but man, he's had some holes in his games and has taken some losses. And this one was really embarrassing. But Diego Lima looked very good tonight, pulling off a win over Luke Jumo, split decision. The last guy I really want to talk a little bit about is you're much more cultured than I am, Miguel. You've been around the world and you know a little bit, but I want to talk a little bit about this Yorgan De Castro, because he fought earlier this year, made his debut on the Dana White Contender Series, fought a very highly decorated wrestler, and really surprised the show. Alton Meeks, who I think was brought in really to be the favorite. He was the heaviest favorite on that episode of the Contender Series. Yorgan De Castro really shut him down in that first round and then dropped him with leg kicks and finished him. Comes in tonight and opens up this show with just a beautiful counter right hand at 2:10 of the first round over Justin Tafa. And this is a man who I looked up some of his bio because he was a little emotional after the fight. He was born in Cape Verde, which is apparently kind of an island off of Northwest Africa. And I didn't know if you knew anything about that. And he ended up in Portugal, where he immigrated, and then somehow ended up into the United States. And he really he's a real rags to riches story if you do some research on him. And I did this just in live time because I remember there was something about him from the Dana White Contender Series that stood out. I remembered the name. I remember the performance. He was very impressive. Dana was very impressed with him. And then he comes out, and I think that this guy's really good. He's deceptively athletic. He kicks really well, has really good power. He was defending takedowns against a very highly decorated wrestler on the Contender Series show, and just seems accurate, man. He flattened that guy tonight. And I like to see anybody at heavyweight or light heavyweight come in and make a splash, because those divisions are so talentless, and we need more depth in those divisions. But I didn't know if you knew anything about Cape Verde, and I didn't know just if you wanted to have any comments on a rags to riches story of a guy that came from off the coast of Africa, somehow immigrated into Portugal, ends up in the States, fights in front of 60,000 people, seeing his dreams come true. We've been talking about how people having good years. This man's had a great year this year. I didn't know if you wanted to give some thoughts on Yorgan De Castro before we sign off.
Put me on the spot. I've got a little bit of experience. I did have the good fortune of traveling, and I've got a little bit of world experience, so I'm no expert in anything like that. But those islands off of Africa, just to the north, the Canary Islands and stuff like that, and I'm not surprised that Portugal may have owned the Cape Verde Islands at some point, and that's where the influence comes from. Right where they are, they're actually not very far off of where Brazil is either, so it was probably a transit point at some point.
So this is South Africa, not North Africa.
No. It's what you would consider North Africa, but there's a point where North Africa curves off, and and there's a point where they're not very far, between Brazil. There's a point, obviously, for Brazil to Africa where it's the closest spot, and these islands fall in that area. So now, where do the people come from, like genetically and things like that in the past? I can't tell you if they're African descent or they're from some type of other, but I can tell you the following story. I was part of a reality TV show for MMA that was filmed in Costa Rica, and we filmed 16 fighters of Spanish descent in a house, very similar to the UFC's episode 1, season 1 format. And kid from Peru won the tournament. Good fights and stuff, but like that. When I contacted people from Spain, MMA wasn't that big. MMA was illegal in the country of Spain like that, and they all said, go to the Canary Islands. They wrestle there. They're wrestler-based, and they're really tough guys. The guy, we wound up not being able to get the plane ticket because it was a handful there, but I'm not surprised that in those islands there was a reputation there. So sometimes you do get a guy who's a prodigy, a guy like that. Maybe there's a relation there where those islands also have a wrestler base. He's shown some wrestling and stuff like that. So, more power to him. When you have a story like that and it's genuine, I think you have to run with it all the way.
Yeah, I think that they should definitely put some love behind this guy, and I think they will because he's got a style that's finishing people, and he's got a really cool personality. He's good on the microphone. He's laying people out, and as I mentioned, he's got a pretty cool rag to riches story, so it would not surprise me to see them push him against a top 15 contender, lower top 15 in the heavyweight division because it's so thin anyway. So they could throw him in there against some of these guys. So Jorgen De Castro was really my big takeaway, other than the two big fights of the night. But with that, this has been the Cage Rage Podcast, UFC 243 recap. It is Israel, this last style bender, Adesanya's night. He unifies the middleweight title, defeating Robert the Reaper Whittaker in the second round by stoppage, and now becomes a true superstar in the UFC. Any last words, Miguel?
Wrong again, I guess. I thought Whittaker was at least going to make it interesting, and at no point did it transcend into that where he was a danger to Adesanya. Just the being able to lean back and not and make Whittaker miss. It's very efficient. That lean back is an extremely efficient move because he's just not there. It doesn't matter if you miss by a mile or if you miss by 2 inches. And that's all he has to do is lean back. The physicality difference was just too much for him. The athletic difference was just too much today. And that does make Adesanya the transcendent guy here in the last 18 months.
Yeah, for sure. He's very high level. He understands range very well. And this was just, as I mentioned, in like my little monologue, you talk the talk is one thing, you back it up by walking the walk. And that's how you become a superstar. And I think Israel Adesanya did just that tonight. Signing off, we will get back later this week to recap some news, preview next week. We got Joanna on Jacek taking on Michelle, the Karate Hottie Watterson, next week in Tampa Bay, Florida. We will be back, and I'll talk to you soon, Miguel.
Hey, thanks a lot for having me. And everybody try to hit like and subscribe. Devin always giving us the lowdowns on Wednesdays and Sundays with the UFC. So, and basically all the world of mixed martial arts. So keep your eye out for the Cage Rage Podcast.
Talk to you soon.